Welcome to the Color of Success podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Stephanie J. Wong. Well, I'm so excited to have Dr. Jocelyn Sze here. She's a clinical psychologist and trainer based in the San Francisco Bay Area. She holds a BA in psychology from Stanford University and a PhD in clinical psychology from UC Berkeley. She specializes in cognitive behavioral therapy, or CBT, and eye movement desensitization and reprocessing, or more widely known as EMDR, using an equity-minded lens. Her primary research interests include emotion, empathy, and Asian American identity, and Dr. Sze has published in leading scientific journals in such areas. She serves as treasurer for the trauma nonprofit Bay Area Trauma Recovery Clinical Services and board member for the McCune Foundation, which supports grassroots organizations that empower and mobilize historically excluded populations. In 2021, Dr. Sze founded the Free Needle Phobia Pilot, which harnesses a nationwide collective of CBT exposure therapists to help people with needle phobia get vaccinated. Dr. Sze, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you so much, Stephanie, for providing this opportunity. It's really fun to connect over this together.
Absolutely. When I saw your protocol that was being sent around the listservs, I was like, I didn't even think about that piece because, getting the vaccination has become so politicized, so divided that's right. I didn't even think about, what if I was afraid of the needle? Because I was like, hey, shoot my arm up.
Right.
So could you tell us a bit just to start about your background and how you ended up creating this protocol out of anything else?
Right. Sure thing. Yeah. No, it's so funny because that's the most common response that I get when I tell folks I'm working on this project and they're like, needle phobia, that makes sense, but I've never really thought about that before as it applies to vaccination. And I think that's what's been really rewarding about working on this project of really building this nationwide awareness. And I think for me personally, like so many of us, this project was born out of this despair, to be honest, around the Delta variant and the sense of hopelessness. And but also in my own clinical world, specializing in phobias, having worked with needle phobias, having seen what a hugely debilitating and powerfully intense fear this can be, and such a roadblock to accessing the healthcare that someone is wanting and needing. And so kind of putting those two things together was how this project was really born. And as I dug further into that rabbit hole of really looking at the data of 10 to 25% of adults meeting criteria for needle phobia.
It's huge.
It's huge. And just, reading this recent meta-analysis that was showing that, 16% of the adult population reports that they don't get flu shots specifically because of needle phobia. And I think one of the pieces of data that most surprised me was in this meta-analysis of looking at hospital employees across the United States, over 25% of hospital employees reported that they refuse flu shots due to needle phobia.
Wow.
So it's pretty widespread, and especially with the COVID vaccine being so new and unfamiliar, I think it starts to really, the more you dig and learn, the more empathy and compassion, I think, is really sprung out of, of course, this is going to be one of the things that is contributing to vaccine hesitancy.
Absolutely. And the great thing is our listener base is very diverse. And so not all psychologists or mental health professionals. So could you explain the difference between maybe just general nervousness about getting a needle or a shot, or, some people are just like, I'm never getting a tattoo, versus really being phobic and what that criteria might look like?
Right. That's such a good question. And it's so, it's both simple and complex. It's complex in that, I've worked with people with needle phobia who have lots of tattoos and are okay with tattoos and the kind of shallow depth that the needles have to go in for tattoos, but absolutely petrified of a vaccination. And so it looks really different, and it's very diverse in terms of what is really triggering that fight or flight response for some people, and where it's not for others. But I would say it's thankfully one of the simpler ones to diagnose, and it's really based off of two main criteria. So the first is, do you have an intensely acute and powerful fear response to the stimulus of a needle?
Yes.
Right. So that's number one. Number two, I think even more importantly, is does that intense fight or flight fear response lead to chronic avoidance of certain types of medical care? So things like not going to the dentist for fear of having to get a Novocaine shot, flu shots, blood work. If there's a chronic pattern of avoidance of medical care, that would lead me to really think about needle phobia. And so nervousness about needles, if someone is saying, oh yeah, they freak me out, I really don't like them, they're unpleasant, but it's not a huge struggle to get to the doctor and get the healthcare that one needs, I wouldn't classify that as a phobia.
Yeah, my husband's the latter, and his dad is a retired pediatrician, so he would chase them around the house with flu shots. Not as like extreme as you guys would imagine, but I think he would still get it, right? And I think that's what you're saying, is there's a differentiation between being scared and bearing through that, and just not getting the medical shots or the medical mental health care that you need.
Right, that's right. And I think there's also that distinction between kids and adults, because I think where this can be kind of latent is that for kids, poor kids, we don't give them a lot of choice and control in their lives. And so most of the participants that I've been working with, adults, they trace their phobia back to a trauma that occurred in childhood around a needle. So a participant I was just working with this week, when she was 5 years old, she had to get an emergency IV. She had such a strong fight or flight response that it required 7 grown adults restraining this small child and holding her down, holding her arms down, holding her legs down. And it was that restraining process that really, really kicked up the phobia, unsurprisingly. Yeah. But she was kind of dragged through the mandatory vaccines and forced through that experience. But then once you turn 18 and it becomes a choice, that's when we see the avoidance really shoot up, because when you're not forced to through just brute restraints, typically that phobia is going to lead to pretty strong avoidance of medical care. And so a lot of kids absolutely have needle phobia, but they're still kind of dragged through the mud and getting those shots because they aren't given any other choice. But that can kind of backfire once they are old enough to have to drive themselves to the vaccination clinic.
Well, I'm even thinking about, when kids have to give blood or they do get injections when they're babies, right? I mean, they obviously don't have the memory or the words, but when they're getting their blood drawn, their veins are so small right now. Right. So I can only imagine for people that are phobic or have had some sense of trauma that they would be extremely afraid, and they can't necessarily assess people's skill level in administration.
Right. That's exactly right.
So tell me more about this protocol and how this could possibly help people, because this is great news that there is something that could do to combat this.
Yeah, I mean, this is really kind of the perfect opportunity to help people. Kind of paradoxically, I think the COVID vaccine has provided a positive opportunity to help manage and overcome needle phobia. And there's a couple of reasons why. One, I would say in terms of motivation level, the project is really geared towards folks that already want to get vaccinated. So I'm not an MD. I'm not in the business of recommending, who should get vaccinated, who should not get vaccinated, or trying to convince people who really don't want to get vaccinated to do something that they don't want to do. Mm-hmm. And so we're really working with people that tend to be highly motivated and are citing this as very important to either their health, the health of their community, going back to school in person, getting back to their jobs because of the vaccine mandates. So the motivation level among our participants tends to be high. And then the vaccine itself, the needle gauge is actually much smaller than in a lot of other needle-related procedures. And so the pain level that people are experiencing tends to be drastically less, which is a surprise to people with needle phobia who have had these really painful, awful injection experiences in the past. And then there's even repeated measures where you have to get vaccinated, typically, if you're not doing the J&J, more than once, which builds up that exposure opportunity to build mastery over time. So interestingly, from an exposure therapist like myself, this is kind of that dream opportunity of harnessing something that is highly important to the individual and to the public health community, and being able to break it down into smaller steps that feel more manageable. And so the protocol is really harnessing time-limited approach of it's 2.5 hours. And in my experience, that's actually been highly organizing, where both the therapist and the participant is saying, okay, time is precious. We have a small amount of time to really see what we can get done together. And we have a really concrete goal ahead of us that we're moving towards. And so all of that structure, I think, really helps to provide focus as well as reduce the sense of overwhelm of, I don't even know where to start, or this problem is too daunting and too big. We can break it down into manageable, more bite-sized pieces. Mm-hmm. And so that's been one thing that's been, I think, effective about this model. And then the two main components, I would say, are one, there's a psychoeducation component, but we're trying to be really careful about delivering psychoeducation that's empowering and affirming, because I think there's a lot of psychoeducation out there that inadvertently is not all that useful or helpful. And, I also specialize in chronic insomnia and work with so many people who have just been like thrown a pamphlet of sleep tips, right? Of like, oh, you got to wind down and meditate before bed and keep your room cool, dark, and quiet, and get away to all this stuff that ends up, when people read this, they think, I've already tried these things. They haven't worked for me. And now I kind of just feel worse because I feel like I'm getting all this education and it's not helpful. And so the psychoeducation we're really centered on is not throwing quick tips at people. Needle phobia is, as I said, so potent. It's so overwhelming, and quick tips ain't gonna cut it. And so the psychoeducation is really geared towards helping people build that deeper understanding of the fight, flight, freeze, and with needle phobia, the faint response, and how that's our body trying its very darn best to protect ourselves and develop a biological adaptive response to a threat. But where needle phobia, that can go awry and actually prevent people from accessing healthcare goals, values-based actions. So really helping them understand the origins and the mechanisms that are maintaining this phobia. And I would say the most helpful part of our psychoeducation that our participants are reporting is this comfort game plan, where we really walk them through advocacy. Really, it's about advocacy of so much of needle phobia to me is actually just an unfortunate byproduct of failings of our healthcare system. That we still use things like restraints on kids to get that blood work done is outdated, and it's unhelpful. It backfires, especially when they become adults. And so building that ability to speak up in these appointments and really advocate for what this person needs to help them feel safer and more comfortable in the experience. So we walk through, who do you want your support person to be, either virtually or in person at the appointment? Do you want the person giving the vaccination to count down 3, 2, 1? Do you want to be watching a TikTok video and harnessing the power of distraction, right? Do you want to be using numbing cream that can drastically reduce any pain sensation associated with the injections? And this all fits on one piece of paper, and our participants are bringing this comfort game plan to their vaccine appointments, showing it to the vaccine provider. And actually, in every case we've seen so far, they're reporting, when I was able to advocate for myself, I was floored by the nurse's response, that they kind of bent over backwards to help me feel comfortable. I was astounded by, their kindness and what they did to help accommodate, this fear of mine, and really exercising that skill of speaking up and saying, I have needle phobia. This is what I need, is that big piece in our psychoeducation. And then the other second piece is exposure. So it's exposure practice. And I'm happy to go into that further, because I think that one is such an important model. And I would say that's the meat and potatoes of this protocol is based off of exposure therapy.
Absolutely. I think that would be so helpful. Just a few comments on what you just mentioned. I think as we head in, fortunately, the vaccine will roll out to children relatively soon. And I'm sure there'll be tweaks and things like that to think about, even if we're able to talk with parents or children in this regard. But what you were just talking about is so important even for kids. Like when you are taking your child to get the vaccination, just really making sure that they feel comfortable in communicating that. And I found that it's helpful to also ask phlebotomist or nurse comfort with administration to children, or getting their blood, because while some people say everyone can do it, then there's another follow-up question of, but who's the best or who feels the most comfortable, right? Not to put down your coworkers, but there's just some people who have had more experience doing that. So right. I think that advocacy piece is so important that you're talking about.
Right. I think it's with so many systems where let's say 60% of kids don't struggle with needle phobia. The numbers are actually incredibly high among kids. It is about 25 to 40% among elementary school age kids. But when the majority isn't having a problem with it, systems will tend to cater towards that majority and say, hey, for this kid, it's just a poke. There's a tear, and then they get their lollipop and they're off, right?
Right.
And so they really think about the 25 to 40%, that subpopulation that actually needs a very different type of experience, and thinking about vaccine providers that are really specialized for needle phobia and kind of have that badge of needle phobia friendly vaccinator is something that I hope that our healthcare system can move towards and differentiate care and know that it's not a one size fits all for anything out there.
That's fantastic. I'm sure a lot of our nurses at our hospital would love that. And they have been great. They definitely check in, but I think it would be really helpful to have some access to training for non-mental health clinicians as well. So, phobias are one of my favorite things to treat as well, because there is that in vivo, that exposure aspect of it. Now it's a little bit more tricky, I think, with COVID, everyone kind of shifting, or many of us shifting to telehealth.
Yep.
But one of my favorite cases was working with, this was over a decade ago, but working with someone with elevator phobia and going in there and, walking up the stairs versus going into the elevator. So can you tell people a little bit more about what exposure therapy is and how it is applicable to, your protocol?
Yeah, no, I'm right there with you. It's one of my favorite things to work with for a couple of reasons. And I remember actually going up San Francisco VA hospital, the elevator with my claustrophobia veteran. And just what I love about working with this is everyone has fears, right? To be human is to live with fear. And to me, the difference between the people that we get to work with and the rest of the world is these folks are having the courage to go into their fear, face their fear, wrestle with it on the ground, work with it, right? And it's just very inspiring for me to be able to see on this daily basis people kind of picking their worst fear, whether it's needles or whether for me it's porta potties. I have it's like deathly fear of porta potties. I avoid them at all costs.
In your defense, they are pretty disgusting, but
they're just like I cannot habituate to this fear. But we all there's its vulnerability, right? So, we all have our fears. And I'm just daily inspired by people picking the thing that makes them most afraid, trusting me as their therapist to kind of sit and witness this as they go into it and lean into it and learn that they can handle it and learn that they can tolerate it as they move towards the things that matter to them, right? And so to me, exposure, right, in a nutshell, is really based off this idea that the most natural response to fear is avoidance. But unfortunately, that avoidance maintains fear over time and really blocks people from accessing new information and learning new information to integrate into this association with the feared stimulus, in this case, needles. And so in exposure, we're really asking people to reverse that urge to avoid and engage with the topic safely. So exposure practice really breaks that fear into smaller, more manageable steps so the brain can rewire its automatic fight or flight response to needles and learn. And this is really important, through experience, not through didactics, not through me telling them, but through experience, that needles, while still really unpleasant, they're safe. Mm-hmm. And through that experience, that really starts to melt that fight, flight, freeze response. And so the next time that stimulus is confronted, that fight or flight response is actually diminished. And that's what's so lovely, is that it's not that we're asking people every time they encounter the stimulus to surf through these unbearable surges of anxiety, that those surges diminish with time. They're still usually absolutely there, but they get more into that window of tolerance where it's not completely shutting down the nervous system, and people feel like they can function with it.
I think that's a really great point, because there's a lot of strength in going through all the sessions, because like I tell people, you're stirring up a pot. And for many people, even with trauma or, that you're going to feel crappy at first, because you are actually facing something that has been buried for so long. But so we do sometimes see dropout in, third or fourth session. But if you can make it over that hump and just continue to show up and engage, it is in the long run the best gold standard solution that we can provide.
That's so true. That 3 to 4 session, or that hump, it's one thing I actually want to build within this project is sharing more in terms of peer support, because that peer support is so important to hearing from others who experience the same level of intensity of fear, but have gone past that hump, right? That peak, and found benefit through exposure therapy. To me, hearing those stories from those that have walked the walk is so much more powerful than a therapist telling them, right? It's about kind of really hanging on through that hardest part to get to the reward.
Yeah. And I think what you're alluding to as well is integrative care, right? Is that if everyone's kind of supporting that person in facing their fear, their anxiety, then they'll feel more supported overall.
That's right.
So one of the things that's been asked by listeners is to let them in our world. And, psychology, mental health practice, interventions, et cetera, aren't mystical. And so
Right.
I wanted to give them a sense of, I'm going to play kind of like a client. Obviously, we're not going to do a 2.5 hour role play, but just to get a sense of, I come into your office and, just say, Dr. Sze, I really want to get this vaccine. I want to go out. I want to see my friends. What can I do here? I came here because my mom is on my back. I need to get this shot to go see her.
Right. That is right. And Stephanie, I love that idea of demystifying this through role play. I think it's such an important thing for us to be doing more of, and to really build more transparency about what happens, so that people can build some trust and some sense of understanding before they have to start this process. So thank you for doing what you're doing. And the neat part about this is it's all been over teletherapy. And so it's really this, you are in my office right now, and this is it. So here we are. And so, I think role play wise, the meatiest part would be on trying to get a window into the exposure component. And so maybe if we fast forward through that comfort game plan where we've already built some strategies together on how you are going to advocate for yourself on the appointment to reduce needle related fear and pain in the moment. But then there's still more fear that we're going to work with together through exposure, and figuring out how to activate that fear, surf out that fear, and learn what we can from that. And so at this stage, what I would have hoped for, let's say this is session 2, is that you've completed your homework, which...
Oh, I'm a great student. Of course.
Of course you are. And that homework was creating this exposure hierarchy, where on index cards, I have folks rate, 0 to 100 distress level. And we're really trying to get some that are in the 20 range, some that are in the 40 range, 60 range, 80 range. Most people that we're working with, the vaccine is at about a 95, blood work being about 100, and the vaccine being about a 95. So really, really high levels, acute panic response activated through the vaccine. And so we'd be picking out together in this session something in that 40 to 60, 40 to 70 range. And that's part of making this a safe and manageable experience where you feel like you are in the driver's seat. To me, I really don't want to replicate this experience of someone feeling dragged through the mud and forced into an experience that they weren't ready for. So finding that sweet spot together is how we don't replicate that prior trauma, right? And so I'd be asking you, in that 40 to 60 range, and I can give you some examples if that's helpful. What comes up for you that might be in a more moderate range compared to actually getting the vaccine?
Well, I think even seeing one of my family members get it is really scary to me, even though they're not afraid. I would say, watching them get it and having to actually see the needle go in, like, ugh.
Yeah, going into the arm tends to be one of the scariest parts for folks, for sure. And how would you rate, what's your prediction of how much distress? So 100 would be debilitating. We got to send you to the hospital. It's just completely overwhelming. 0 is cool as a cucumber, neutral. 50, I always like to think about as you can kind of hold a conversation, but you are clearly distracted internally with a feeling of dread or worry, or your heart is racing, your thoughts are going faster, maybe you have sweatiness in your armpits. That would be about a 50, but I might not even be able to tell that you're feeling any anxiety, but internally it's quite active. So watching a family member get vaccinated, what would you rate that as?
Yeah, I would put it in that 50 to 60 range. I mean, you probably could notice on my face, but probably doesn't look like I'm having a freak out moment, but
Right.
I really do probably would feel that.
Right. Okay, that's perfect then. That's a good place for us to start. And so what we're going to do for the purpose of really learning exposure, and then I'm going to send you out into the real world, and we're going to design some experiments where you can test this out in the real world too. But for our purposes right now, I have a whole database of videos of people getting vaccinated and the needle going into
Dr.
the
C,
arm.
did you go and record people in CVS? Like
pretty much. And I have a pretty diverse range of, close-ups of the needle going into the arm, of multiple people getting vaccinated in rapid succession. And for exposure, what we've talked about a little bit before is repetition, unfortunately, is one of the most effective parts of exposure, because what's so interesting about anxiety is that it takes a lot of energy for the sympathetic nervous system to continuously hit that gas pedal, to push cortisol, endorphins, adrenaline, all of those things through the body. And so with time, if we hang in there long enough, anxiety actually runs out of gas. So what we want to accomplish today is we don't want to stop at the peak, because that's really teaching the brain, this is scary, I'm going to flee, I'm going to avoid because it was too intolerable. And then we've kind of taught the brain, note to self, avoid that thing at all costs in the future, because we stopped at that 80 level and it was terrifying, right? So we're going to really use our therapeutic relationship together and some of the grounding tools we've been practicing to hang out as long as you can, so we can reach the backside of that wave. If we're at the 20-foot wave, we want to reach that backside together and watch it subside. And so we're probably going to loop that video together, only if you are willing. And so this is where I ask for your permission, and also any questions that you have before we start something like this.
Yeah, I mean, how often would I have to watch this video outside of session? Even hearing that gives me anxiety in my stomach.
Yeah. So, after the end of our, 2.5 hour pilot together, I see people move into two different categories. One is folks are actually ready to book that appointment. And I talk about shrinking your worry. Actually book it sooner than later, because 90% of needle phobia lies in the anticipation. It's anticipatory. It's the imaginary scenarios of what could happen and what could go wrong that produces a lot of anxiety for the system. So we want to shrink that by just ripping off the Band-Aid and getting it over with. But then the second group would be folks that, for so many different reasons, that needle phobia response is still much too high to feel a readiness and confidence to get to that vaccination appointment. Mm-hmm. And so that's when I would be assigning daily exposure homework. So it usually is about 15 to 20 minutes every single day, until that habituation response occurs. Habituation just being a gradual unpairing of the feared stimulus with the fear response. And importantly, we're not looking for perfection here. We're just looking for good enough to be just able to get into that window of tolerance so that we can carry those anxiety symptoms with us when we go to Walgreens or when we go to the hospital clinic. So I'll be checking in with you at the end to see, which one feels right for you.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
Well, that was great. I mean, I was like, end scene. But I mean, that was pretty much a simulation of what you would experience. Like you were letting people into our world, because it really, like I tell a lot of people, it's a conversation. But even our loved ones don't know what we do behind these closed doors in these therapy rooms unless they've gone themselves. And so, you're so empathic and supportive. And I think the key thing when people are looking for therapists is, like I tell them, do you feel heard? Do you feel like you can voice your concerns to your therapist? and that they're culturally competent, which is important to me, but, it depends on the person. But,
right.
And that's, I guess that's another question. In the Asian American community, have there been a lot of Asian American clients that have come in with these concerns? Because, we're looking at Asians, and I don't want to group everyone together.
Of course.
But there are other Asian countries that want the vaccine so much.
Right.
And so I'm wondering how you see that in comparison to within the US.
Right. In our small pilot, we've had a very diverse group of people sign up and register. And that's been one of the more exciting parts of this project. Like you, I care so much about how do we create culturally responsive, culturally affirming care? How do we think about equity and different barriers to care experienced by different racial and ethnic groups in this country? And so we've had it's a small pilot thus far, but a diverse group coming through our doors. And I think what's been neat is it's not just diverse in terms of racial background, but also where folks are coming from in terms of states, right? So we have Midwest, Southern states, East Coast, West Coast, all of those states currently represented. And
it's amazing.
That, especially because California is doing better than average on the vaccination rates, my hope was really for this to spread into other states that have more vaccination hesitancy. And then with Asian Americans, we can look at some of the data. For example, there was a study done this year on, it was just over 16,000 adults participated in this survey in the UK. And that study found that 26% of the UK population between the ages of 18 to 80 screened positive for needle phobia. Wow. And that rates of needle phobia among the group that they sampled were higher among Black residents as well as Asian residents. And so, that does not surprise me when we look at the history of racial bias in the medical care system, that we do see a correlation with experiences where someone has felt dismissed or unheard or traumatized in their healthcare experience and their medical experience, and that we do see higher rates of mistreatment among people of color in the United States. I don't know as much in the UK, but we're just seeing the numbers be fairly consistent in that way. And so the problem of medical anxiety to me is really a systemic issue, right? And so I really see this as almost a wartime effort around, okay, we have a current crisis around not being able to build enough safety and trust between the healthcare system and science and the people, the population, right? Yeah. And that CBT exposure therapy, I think of as a little bit of a Band-Aid because it's not solving any of these wider systemic issues, but it is saying no one should have to die of needle phobia. I had a volunteer therapist just write in from Ohio saying that she just lost someone because they couldn't get vaccinated because of needle phobia specifically, right? This is not something that people should be dying from. And so it's trying to increase access to healthcare and knowing that there is an inequity component to it that falls on racial lines, but that it's the tip of the iceberg, right? in that.
Well, yeah, something that occurred to me too was that, for those that speak different languages, because advocacy is such a huge part of it. What are some thoughts about how we can address that? I know it's another big societal situation.
You hear my sigh. Yeah, it's so hard and so important. It's so important. Yeah, I don't have the answers to that. Some of the places that I think have are developing answers, for example, and this is highly localized to the Bay Area, of Asian Health Services. And so they're a nonprofit. Do you know Asian Health Services by any chance? They're based in Oakland, Chinatown, and they have over 40 languages represented in their healthcare capacity. Actually, I'm not sure if it's over 40. They have a whole bunch of languages represented, and this incredible language capacity. And they're really targeting that without language capacity, you are really preventing access to medical care in the US. And so there, and it just takes a tremendous amount of organization and resources to be able to build that language capacity. And so that would be a dream of mine. Is my hope is that through this pilot, we can kind of prove out a model of, man, if we can get people vaccinated, and we launched October 1st, we're just starting to get the first people vaccinated through this pilot, which feels so exciting. And so we're kind of proving out this model. We definitely need to collect more information, but it's encouraging to see 2.5 hours can open this door. The stories we're hearing of, I've avoided all flu shots for the last 20 years of my life. I've never interacted with a needle in the last 20 years. And through this program, I just got my Pfizer vaccine. That feels like something that I'd want a little bit more widely disseminated in multiple languages, and really funded better. This is purely volunteer run, very like mom and pop little rinky dink thing right now. So, get some government funding. And I think that, again, that's a big can of worms, right? We don't have a universal healthcare system.
Yes.
The programs that are out there to address needle phobia tend to be places like the UK and Canada that do have more of that universal healthcare system.
But this is so important. And that's why, I really, aside from you being awesome, I really wanted you to come on here and talk about it, because like we're talking about, let's not make it something mystical where people go to a psychologist to address some fear. It's really, there are resources out there, and very kind, compassionate people that can help you through this. And I have no doubt that this will be funded at some point, because it really is needed. And it's just more about, like you said, not shoving it down people's throats, but that psychoeducation, like, hey, this is working. And this may be the hidden factor that's leading people not to get vaccinated. It's not that people are anti-vaxxers, right?
That's right. I think that's actually a much smaller portion of the vaccine hesitancy than the media and this kind of culture is really understanding. Yeah.
Exactly. So tell us so someone is experiencing needle phobia. Where can they sign up for this? Where can they find out more information?
Sure. Absolutely. No, thank you. Yeah. So our website is idon'tlikeneedles.com.
Wow. No one bought that, huh?
When I went in, I was like, oh my goodness, this is so under kind of vocalized and amplified that there's so many choices out there that no one has ever bought and looked into related to needle phobia, because there just has been insufficient awareness on it for whatever reason. And so that's the website. I've tried to make it really easy to just kind of click a button and fill out a form to register. And we're still, for adults, we've closed the program for teens, but for anyone 18 and up, still registering both participants and therapists. We actually are fully registered for the state of California, which is so, I'm so floored and grateful for the amount of therapists. I mean, we've had hundreds and hundreds of hours pledged from volunteers across the country. And so more interested right now in volunteers that can see folks in PsyPact states that have their PsyPact certificate to be able to see in Midwestern and Southern states. And then one of the other parts of this project is really trying to open source. This should not be there should not be barriers to accessing this type of treatment. In my view, this is a public health issue. And so really building out our resources page. And so we have so many goodies on that page at this point on imaginal exposures. One of my colleagues, Heather Wasserman, put together these incredible audio imaginal exposures of walking through getting the vaccine at a pharmacy, at a mass vaccination site, at a doctor's office, and a lot of great videos of people who have severe needle phobia and what their experience was like getting vaccinated, really sharing stories. That peer support piece is something that we're building out on the resources page right now.
Well, I can't wait for Ronald, our editor, to put IDon'tLikeNeedles.com like on the bottom banner. This will be great. But no, I think thank you so much for sharing that, because even if someone doesn't formally register, they can still have some resources there. And I think that's right. The point is like this podcast is for that, because as you know, we cannot meet the demand of the one-on-one sessions. I mean, it's great for business. The part is we just can't.
It's too inefficient. One-on-one is really a slow model. And so, exactly. That's the point of the resources is there is such a spectrum where there are folks that can just engage with the resources on the website. They can download the Comfort Game Plan and they're good to go, right? And so we're trying to really triage and get people at these different levels and differentiate and reserve that one-on-one therapy for the people that need it.
Yeah. Well, I'm so excited to share this, and I'm sure, we already have that in for the listserv to be able to use, and you can use any clips from this interview just to help with, resources and getting the word out there, because I think it's just so important and admirable what you and the rest of the team, is doing. So thank you so much.
Oh my gosh. Thank you, Steph. No, seriously, I'm so grateful for what you're doing. And it's so needed. I really hope more psychologists kind of can do the type of work that you're doing to really spread awareness, get the word out, demystify what we do, have a platform for people of color. It's really rad. So I respect what you're doing. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Well, I will definitely link all the resources in the show notes, and Ronald will do his magic in the banner and things like that. So,
thank you so much. I appreciate it. You have a wonderful weekend.
Thank you. Thank you so much for listening to the Color Success Podcast. Listen, like, subscribe on all major streaming platforms, YouTube, IG, and if you want exclusive content, you can join our Patreon. All links can be found at colorofsuccesspodcast.com.